Welcome to the Eclectic. Strasbourg, 1518, a city of narrow streets, hot stone, river damp, church bells and bad water. A city where faith sat close to fear, where famine had teeth and where sickness was not just a bodily thing, but a moral one. People lived with the sense that punishment could arrive disguised as weather, hunger, fever, or grief. Then, in the middle of summer, something began that no one could quite name. A woman stepped into the street and started to dance. Not for a feast, not for music, not for celebration. She danced because she could not seem to stop. Her body moved with the cruel insistence of a machine wound too tight, as if some hidden force had seized her joints and set them in motion. Hours passed. The sun shifted. Her feet struck the ground again and again and again. People watched, puzzled at first, then alarmed, then uneasy, and then frightened, because she did not stop. That is how the story begins. Not with thunder, not with blood on the cobblestones, not with a plague cart, just a single body refusing rest. But what followed would turn a living city into a theatre of breakdown. By the end, dozens would be caught in the same impossible frenzy. Some accounts say hundreds. Men, women, the poor, the devout, the desperate. They danced until their legs gave out, until their lungs burned, until collapse took them hard to the ground. Some screamed, some wept, some looked as if they were being dragged by something only they could feel. Others, well, they simply kept moving, even when movement had become agony. And the strangest part? The authorities did not immediately try to stop it. They tried to help, which may have made everything worse. To understand the horror of 1518, you have to understand the world that produced it. This was not a world that felt safe in any modern sense. Disease moved fast, hunger moved faster. Childhood was brief, life was brittle, and death was not too far away. It was a neighbour, a visitor, a constant threat at the door. Strasbourg itself was a place of pressure, social strain, economic anxiety, religious dread. The sort of environment in which the mind, stretched too long, can begin to behave like a wound. People believed in divine punishment. They believed in saints, curses, omens, possession. They believed the body could betray the soul, and the soul could poison the body. So when a woman began to dance in the street, people may first have thought little of it. Perhaps she was drunk, perhaps fevered, perhaps simply mad. But then the motion continued. Not a graceful, celebratory dance, but something raw and punishing. A jerking compulsion, a body locked into a rhythm that no one else could hear. Witnesses later described a terrifying persistence, a kind of kinetic imprisonment. She could not settle, could not sit, could not sleep. She could not stop. Her name is often given as Frau Trophäa, though the historical record is thin, fragmented, filtered through later retellings. Even so, her role in the story has become symbolic, the first spark in a city already dry with fear. Imagine the scene. A street in summer heat. Dust, sweat, the smell of horse waste and human bodies, and stale wood smoke. A woman moving under a cruel sun, while passer-bys slow, stare, and gather. At first, it's curiosity, then gossip, then that ancient human instinct. If one person is doing something incomprehensible, maybe someone in authority will explain it? No explanation came, so the crowd watched longer, and watching changed the atmosphere. It always does. There is a point in any strange event where observation becomes participation. Eyes sharpen on the thing they are fixed upon. Concern becomes spectacle. Spectacle becomes contagion. And in a city primed for fear, the sight of one body refusing obedience may have been enough to infect the imagination of others. Soon, More people were dancing, not because they wanted to. That is the part that haunts the mind. They were said to have felt compelled, as though seized by a private storm no priest, no physician or magistrate could see. Some accounts suggest the compulsion spread quickly, like panic wearing a human face. Others point to physiology, stress, hunger, toxin, infection. The truth may be less theatrical than legend, but it is no less disturbing. Ordinary people in an ordinary street losing control of their own bodies in public. One by one, they entered the same terrible motion, and once it began, the city had to decide what kind of thing it was witnessing. Illness? Sin? Possession? Or something far more frightening, a collapse of the boundary between mind and flesh. The reaction of the authorities is one of the darkest parts of the story, because it reveals a world thinking with the wrong tools. Today, we would isolate, investigate, treat, contain. In 1518, the answer was tangled in theology and superstition. The leaders of Strasbourg looked at a public frenzy and reached for the logic available to them. If the dancers could not stop, perhaps they should be allowed to continue until the force burned itself out. If the body was trapped in an affliction, maybe motion was the purge. So, musicians were brought in. Yes, musicians. The city is already strained, already unnerved, and now a decision is made to encourage the movement with sound. Not silence, not restraint, rhythm, tempo, and reinforcement. Picture that for a moment. A woman trembling with exhaustion, her feet raw, her chest heaving, her limbs no longer under her command. Around her, others caught in the same trance, and nearby, men with instruments beginning to play, offering melody to suffering, turning a crisis into a controlled performance. It is difficult to imagine a more chillingly misguided response, because if the condition was psychological, then the attention magnified it. If it was neurological, the stimulation worsened it. If it was rooted in terror, the spectacle fed it. Whatever the origin, the response gave the outbreak a stage, and a stage is never neutral. What begins as a strange event can become an identity. What begins as fear can become role. The dancers may have felt trapped not only by their bodies, but by the fact of being seen. One person collapses, another takes their place. The crowd grows, rumour swells, anxiety deepens. The city begins to narrate itself around the outbreak, which is one of the surest ways panic spreads. Then came the injuries. There was raw feet, swollen joints, overheated bodies, exhaustion so severe it bends the face into something not quite human. Some dancers reportedly fell and could not rise. Others kept jerking through pain that should have forced stillness. A few accounts, they describe deaths from sheer collapse, though exact numbers are uncertain and later stories may have exaggerated the gore. But still, the image remains brutal enough without embellishment. People dancing until their bodies broke. Not in joy, not in abandon, but in torment. And all the while, the city kept trying to understand the outbreak through ritual and authority, as if the answer might be hiding in the right prayer, the right saint, or the right ceremony. St. Vitus was invoked, because he was linked to dance mania and convulsive affliction. Pilgrimages were ordered, blessings were sought. Exorcistic language hovered over the event like smoke. But the logic of the time created its own trap. To treat the dancers as spiritually afflicted was to frame them as vessels of sin or curse, not patients in need of containment. To let them continue moving was to intensify the horror. To gather them, to watch them, to name them, that was to make the condition visible enough to become communal. And once a community begins to fear itself, it becomes easier for fear to reproduce. There is something uniquely disturbing about involuntary movement. Pain you can understand. Bleeding you can understand. Even fear as a shape. But to be trapped inside a body that will not obey, that keeps time without permission, that forces you into exertion where you need rest, is to lose one of the quiet assumptions that makes consciousness bearable. The dancers of 1518 were not merely exhausted, they were, in the old sense, overtaken. Well, that word does matter, because overtaken implies an invasion of will, a trespass, something crossing a line. In a pre-modern setting, the line between body, soul, and social life was porous. If a person acted strangely, the community did not ask only what chemical imbalance or pathogen might be at work. They asked what had entered the person, what had been invited, what had been angered, what had been suppressed until it erupted. That is why the story, it still unsettles people, because it does not feel like a neat disease event. It feels like a rupture in the social fabric, a moment when private distress became public choreography. It feels like the city itself developed a tic, a spasm, or a convulsion. And whether the cause was mass psychogenic illness, ergot poisoning, neurological disease, or something else, the terror is the same. Human beings can be pushed past the edge of self-command. The people of Strasbourg did not know that. They saw something uncanny, something moral, something dangerous, and they tried to answer it with the tools of their age. That choice, more than the dancing itself, gives the story its lasting dread, because it suggests a nightmare many societies repeat in different forms. When institutions misunderstand suffering, they can amplify it. By now, the outbreak had stopped being strange and unbearable. The dancers were no longer an oddity in the street. They were a problem the city could not file away and could not bury, and they couldn't ignore. The frenzy had spread beyond a single woman, beyond a handful of companions, beyond the realm of rumour. It had become public fact, a shared nightmare, the kind that changes the air in a room. People were said to have danced for hours, then days, then longer still. Some moved until their bodies seemed to lose all dignity and function. Their faces slackened, their clothes clung with sweat, their feet blistered, split, bled. The body, which should have been a place of shelter, became a prison of punishment. And that is what makes the story so oppressive. Not simply the movement, but the refusal of relief. There was no rest, no release, no neat moment where the spell breaks and everyone can breathe again. Instead, the city watched its own citizens waste away in public. Accounts from the time suggest that some dancers collapsed and were carried away, only to be replaced by others who had joined the convulsion. It was as if the crisis had learned how to move through the population. One body failed, another stepped into the rhythm. One set of limbs gave out, another took over the burden. The event did not behave like a single outburst. It behaved like a contagion of terror. And once the authorities realised the dancing was not stopping, they responded with a mixture of urgency and helplessness that feels almost cruel in hindsight. Musicians were still involved. The idea, according to later descriptions, was that the dancers might work the affliction out if the motion were encouraged and structured. The city, it effectively fed the convulsion. It gave the outbreak accompaniment. It wrapped suffering in sound and hoped the arrangements would become medicine. It did not. If anything, it made the whole thing more obscene. Because now there was no private torment, no hidden breakdown behind closed doors. The city had made it a public performance. The afflicted were no longer merely ill. They were being watched while they suffered. Watched while they failed. Watched while their bodies performed agony in front of an audience. That too is a kind of violence. There is a special terror in public collapse. Not just pain, but exposure. Not just weakness, but witness. The dancers were trapped in a condition that stripped away modest agency and control all at once. Every stumble became a spectacle. Every grimace became part of the story. Every fall into exhaustion turned into a visible mark of helplessness. This is where the legend grows most macabre. Some later accounts say dancers died on the spot. Others say they collapsed after days of movement, their hearts giving out, their minds fraying, their muscles failing them. The exact number is impossible to know, and the more graphic stories may be embroidered by later imagination. The image itself has endured, people dancing until the body could take no more. It is easy to sensationalize that image, harder to sit with what it implies. These were not actors in a cursed pageant. They were not mythic figures in a fable. They were people in a real city under real pressure, surrounded by real fear, and they were being consumed by an event that nobody could properly name. That is why the story feels so wrong, because the human mind wants causes with edges. We want one culprit, one explanation, and one ending. The Dancing Plague, it offers none of that comfort. Eventually, Strasbourg changed course. The music stopped. The dancing was no longer treated as something to be encouraged. The city shifted toward religious intervention, as if the answer might lie not in rhythm, but in repentance. Pilgrimages were ordered. Holy figures were invoked. St. Vitus became central to the narrative, because in that era, unexplained convulsion and sacred punishment were often intertwined. The afflicted were taken to a shrine associated with the saint. Prayers were offered, rituals were performed. The response moved from stimulation to supplication. Even that, however, is telling. The community did not suddenly understand the crisis. It simply swapped one framework for another. First, the body had been pushed to dance. Then the soul was asked to confess. In both cases, the dancers were not fully treated as victims of something outside their control. They remained objects of interpretation, and interpretation can be its own form of captivity. What finally ended the outbreak is unclear. It may have faded because the social conditions shifted. It may have burned out because the frenzy could not sustain itself once the city stopped reinforcing it. It may have diminished as the most vulnerable were removed, exhausted, isolated, or simply too broken to continue. This is where the narrative becomes more tragic than theatrical. There was no dramatic exorcism scene, no clean cinematic break, no thunderbolt from above. The event appears to have ebbed slowly after weeks of fear and strain. That kind of ending is less satisfying than a miracle, but more believable. Disasters often do not end. They just weaken, then recede, leaving damaged people behind. And the damage may have lingered long after the dancers stopped moving. Think of the aftermath. People who had watched neighbours convulse in the street, families who had carried home the exhausted, children who had seen bodies collapse in public, officials who had made disastrous decisions with confidence, priests who had prayed against a terror they did not understand, a city that had turned suffering into spectacle and then had to live with the memory. That memory is the real ghost of 1518, not just the dancing itself, but the collective realization that everyone had witnessed something beyond the ordinary and had failed to contain it. What may have caused it? This is where the story leaves folklore and enters argument. For centuries, explanations have competed with one another. Some old theories are now mostly historical artifacts themselves: possession, divine punishment, poisoned blood, heated humours, demonic influence, saintly wrath. These were not silly ideas in their time. They were coherent within the worldview of the 16th century, but they do not satisfy modern inquiry. Most recent explanations have tried to ground the event in psychology, neurology, and social stress. One widely discussed interpretation is that the Dancing Plague was a form of mass psychogenic illness, a shared breakdown in a strained population, possibly triggered by starvation, disease, trauma, religious fear, and perhaps social suggestion. That theory has real weight, because the world of 1518 was exactly the sort of world in which collective panic could take on a physical form. There are also competing Physiological hypothesis. Some researchers have looked at ergot poisoning, the toxic fungus sometimes found in rye, which can cause hallucinations and convulsions. Others have proposed neurological conditions, such as chorea. A newer line of argument has suggested that a streptococcal infection might have contributed, possibly producing a form of Sydenham's chorea or related movement disorder. None of these theories has won the case definitively, and maybe that uncertainty is part of the lasting power of the story. Because the dancing plague sits in the space between medicine and myth. It is not solved cleanly enough to become a neat case study, and not vague enough to be dismissed as legend. It remains open, unsettled, and waiting. That makes it fertile ground for horror, not because the facts are embellished, but because the facts themselves are unsettling enough. A city under strain, a woman who cannot stop moving, a crowd that follows. Authorities who feed the fire before trying to smother it. Bodies that fall in public, no easy explanation, no universal agreement, and no comfort. If the cause was psychological, then the mind can drive the body into ruin. If the cause was neurological, then the body can betray the mind. If the cause was social, then the crowd itself becomes a disease. Every explanation is frightening in its own way. The crowd matters here, more than many retellings admit. A lone woman dancing in the street would be curious. A lone woman dancing for days would be alarming, but a growing group of people joining in the same compulsion transforms the event into something else entirely. Crowds change human behaviour in ways that are both ordinary and strange. They amplify emotion. They reduce hesitation. They create a pressure to mirror what is already visible. People look to one another for cues, especially in moments of uncertainty. When no one knows what is happening, the behaviour of others becomes a form of evidence. That is one reason the outbreak may have spread at all. Each new dancer would have been both a symptom and a signal. A sign that the condition is real, a sign that the condition could spread, and a sign that perhaps, in some terrible way, participation was unavoidable. The psychological power of that dynamic is brutal. Imagine being in a city where everyone is talking about the dancers. Imagine seeing them in the street, clearly exhausted and unable to stop. Imagine hearing the music, seeing the crowd, not knowing whether the event is a punishment, a disease, a curse, or an omen. If you were already frightened, already stressed, already physically run down, how much would it take for your body to begin echoing the panic around you? That is the sort of question this case leaves behind. Not because it can be answered cleanly, but because it cannot. And that lack of closure is exactly what makes the dancing plague linger in cultural memory. It is one of those historical episodes that presses on the mind because it feels less like a solved event than a warning. Not about dancing, but about fragility. The historical record for the dancing plague is frustrating in the way many old horrors are frustrating. Vivid in outline, but thin in detail. We know the outbreak happened in Strasbourg in 1518. We know it began with a woman dancing in the street. We know others joined. We know authorities intervened in ways that now seem bizarre, even reckless. We know the event lasted weeks, and we know contemporaries found it disturbing enough to write about. What we don't know is almost as important. We don't know exactly how many people were involved. We don't know how many died, if any died at all in the numbers later writers claimed. We don't know whether the dancers were driven by illness, fear, suggestion, toxin, or perhaps a combination of forces, or a combination of lots of things. We don't know what the first dancer felt in those opening hours, or whether anyone around her understood that the city had already crossed into danger. That uncertainty matters because the story has been repeatedly shaped by later imagination. Over time, writers have made it more grotesque, more theatrical, more symbolic. That is how folklore works. It reaches backward and paints the past in stronger colours than the evidence always supports. But even after trimming away exaggeration, the core remains terrifying. People were dancing against their will. The city responded badly. The event spread. No one fully understood it. That is enough to make the story endure. The Dancing Plague reveals how thin the line can be between individual distress and collective crisis. It reveals how institutions can misread suffering when they are guided by outdated assumptions. It reveals how ritual and medicine can blur together when neither has enough power to help. It reveals how quickly a community can turn a symptom into a spectacle. But most of all, it reveals how human beings explain the inexplicable. When people do not understand what is happening, they reach for the nearest language available to them. In 1518, that language included saints, curses, demonic influence, and divine displeasure. Today, we might reach for neurology, epidemiology, psychology, toxicology. The vocabulary changes. The urge stays the same. We want a container. We want a cause. We want a story with boundaries. But the Dancing Plague resists tidy boundaries. The Dancing Plague still grips the imagination because it sits on the edge of things. It is historical, but almost surreal. It is documented, but incomplete. It is bodily, but also psychological. It is public, but intensely private in its suffering. Most importantly, it suggests that terror can become contagious without a visible pathogen. That idea is hard to shake. Modern audiences often want the explanation to be simple. A fungus, a poison, a rare neurological disease, something that's measurable, something that's tidy, and something with a name that can close the file. But even if science eventually settles on one dominant explanation, the emotional truth of the event will remain stranger than any diagnosis. Because the real horror is not merely that bodies moved uncontrollably. It is that human beings looked at that movement and could not stop it. Not at first, not cleanly, and not safely. There is something deeply uncomfortable about that collective helplessness. It suggests that order is fragile, that institution can misread suffering, that crowds can magnify distress instead of relieving it. It suggests that a city, like a person, can become confused, panicked, and self-defeating. That is why the story works so well in horror storytelling. It does not need embellishment to feel wrong. It only needs retelling. A hot street, a woman dancing alone, then 2, then 10, then more. A city trying to reason with terror by making it louder. A public space transformed into a place of collapse. That image has survived because it touches something deeply human and deeply uneasy. The fear that control is thinner than we like to believe. That the line between order and breakdown is not a wall, but a membrane. That bodies can fail in ways that culture cannot always explain. And that when fear spreads, it can acquire a rhythm of its own. That is the real horror of the Dancing Plague. Not that people danced, that they could not stop. So when we remember the Dancing Plague, we should not think only of the spectacle. We should think of the fear before the movement, the confusion during it, the damage after it, the way people try to explain the unbearable because it touches something we would rather not admit, that the human body is vulnerable, that the human mind is vulnerable, and that when fear enters a room, it rarely enters alone. It comes with rhythm, it comes with imitation, it comes with ruin. And sometimes, if history is cruel enough, it comes wearing the face of a dance. If you've enjoyed this episode of The Eclectic, please like, follow and subscribe wherever you listen. It really helps the show grow, and it means a great deal. If you want to support the podcast even more, leave a review, share the episode, or send it to someone who loves strange history, dark mysteries, and the unsettling corners of the past. This has been The Eclectic. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and as always, stay eclectic.